to welcome everyone to meeting number 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Conformément à l'article 108.3h de règlement et la motion adoptée le...
In accordance with 108.3 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, September 17, 2025, the committee is commencing a study of the challenges posed by artificial intelligence and its regulation.
We've got Antoine Guillemin, who is the partner and co-head of Gallings WLG's National Cyber Security and Data Protection Practice Group, and from Machine Intelligence Research Institute, Malo Bourgon, who is the Chief Executive Officer. Mr. Guillemin, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes to address the committee. If you want to start, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président du Comité, Mesdames.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, thank you for having invited me to comment on the challenges related to artificial intelligence. Although I will be testifying in English today, I would be glad to answer your question in French or in English.
Associate professor at the Faculté de Droit de l'Université de Sherbrooke. I'm a practicing lawyer close to the Bar of Quebec and Paris. My evidence today represents my own views, and I'm here as an individual not representing my law firm clients or any third parties. Much of my legal career has focused on comparative analysis of legal regime across the globe, advising clients on their compliance obligation in the jurisdiction where I'm qualified to practice. My practice focuses on data protection and cybersecurity, and naturally extend to artificial intelligence, given its role as a major data-driven technology. Canada has always been, to me, a model of education, growth, and innovation. And that's why I chose to pursue my doctorate, start my family, and build my life here, earning citizenship recently, which remains one of my proudest moments. And I believe that Canada's institution, diverse economy, and cultural innovation create an environment well-suited for the effective development, adoption, and regulation of AI technologies. Today, I would like to discuss the challenge of AI not simply as an ever-evolving technology, but as a new field of regulation. In my view, grounded in my experience in the current international landscape, there are 3 key pitfalls we must not overlook. The first one being newer doesn't mean better. There's a natural tendency to respond to new technology by creating new laws. Yet, consistent with the civil law tradition, leading jurists have long recommended applying ancient law to technological revolutions. This approach is not about doing nothing. Rather, it calls for revisiting existing areas of laws and adapting them case by case to each new technology. Today, AI does not exist in a legal vacuum in Canada. A wide range of legislation already applies, including copyright, liability, trademark law, and data protection. In this last area, we are already seeing new obligations related to automated decision-making, including in Quebec, to ensure transparency when AI is used. In that sense, prior to tabling bills like the former ETHI, we should assess current laws and identify any gaps before imposing new requirements. My second message would be faster doesn't mean better. And there's a natural tendency, again, to adopt laws as quickly as technologies evolves. Yet in law, more than in any other field, slow and steady often prove the wiser approach. And a look at both domestic and international developments illustrate why. In data protection, for example, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was adopted in 2016. But it took Quebec 5 years to amend its own legislation in response with Law 25, particularly in light of the GDPR's international impact. In the realm of AI, the EU AI Act, which came into force in August 2024, is already facing a form of retrenchment, especially regarding implementation timeline and the regulatory burden on tech companies. Whether it will achieve the same success as the GDPR remains uncertain. And closer to home, ETHI faced significant changes after its introduction. The most recent version contained fewer than 70 references to upcoming regulation in just 20 pages. An ambitious effort, but far from a self-contained legislative text. My last message would be, heavier doesn't mean better. And again, there's a tendency to assume that the greater the burden on organization, the better the protection for the public. This is not always the case. And more importantly, it can undermine the competitiveness of small and medium-sized enterprises. ETHI reflected this trend, mandating multiple assessment at various stages of an AI system lifecycle. While theoretically sound, in practice, this approach is rarely feasible, at least based on my experience. So in sum, I believe AI legislation can only succeed through sustained and substantive collaboration with stakeholders in industry, academia, and civil society to ensure any framework, one, reflect a risk-based approach, two, appropriately takes into account the state of AI technologies, including its current limitations, three, assign responsibility along the AI value chain, and finally, harmonize core concept with existing international frameworks. With the chair permission, I would be pleased to submit a short written brief in French and English on the issues I've addressed in my opening remarks. Thank you, and I look forward to answering this committee's question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Guillemette. Mr. Bourgnon, 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Malo Bourgnon, and I'm the CEO of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, or MIRI, a nonprofit founded in the year 2000 to make sure the development of powerful AI systems is beneficial for humanity. I grew up in Ontario, studied engineering and computer science at the University of Guelph, and I've worked at MIRI since 2012. Our research helped create the field of AI alignment, the study of how to build AI systems that reliably want and do what we want them to. Governments face many urgent AI concerns: disinformation, surveillance, labor displacement, threats to democratic institutions. These are all real and important. However, my focus today is on something different. The dangers that AIs that are smarter than the smartest humans at every mental task, what's often termed artificial superintelligence. The leading AI companies today say that the creation of artificial superintelligence is their explicit goal. OpenAI's Sam Altman recently called for making superintelligence cheap and widely available. Anthropic's Dario Amodei talks of building a country of geniuses in a data center. These AI companies weren't founded with the intention of making chatbots. To them, chatbots are a stepping stone. Researchers at MIRI are concerned that if the world continues racing towards superintelligence using anything like today's techniques or understanding, that the default outcome is that we'll lose control, likely resulting in human extinction. Why is there such a big danger here? Well, for one thing, AI is unlike traditional software and doesn't behave exactly as its creators intend. Traditional software is written line by line. A programmer can understand every part. Modern AI systems are grown as enormous neural networks, trained through trial and error with massive computation. Their creators have little insight into what's actually going on inside them. As a result, AIs often exhibit behaviors that nobody asked for and nobody wanted. For years, MIRI has warned of this eventuality. Now we're starting to see early evidence. Frontier AI systems get caught cheating on evaluations. AI sometimes drive users into states that clinicians call AI-induced psychosis, even in cases where the AI systems themselves readily can tell that their responses are harmful to the user. When we look at their chains of reasoning, we see growing signs at attempts at deception. And especially concerning is a complication that models are increasingly recognizing when they're being tested, something called situational awareness. And this threatens the validity of all safety evaluations moving forward. At current capability levels, these behaviors are concerning but not catastrophic. These systems are still limited. But we must ask, what happens when the companies reach the capabilities that they are aiming for? What will future AI systems pursue as their own objectives? If so, what will those objectives be? Do these systems endanger us? Can't we just pull the plug? Many who have studied these questions have found the answers quite concerning. Two of the three godfathers of deep learning, which is the paradigm that underlies most of the modern AI systems today, certainly the most powerful ones, Canadians Geoffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, have publicly warned of the dangers of extinction. In 2023, they joined other top AI scientists and even the CEOs of OpenAI, DeepMind, and Anthropic, some of the leading frontier labs, in a statement stating that mitigating the risks of extinction from AI should be a priority alongside pandemics and nuclear war. Some of these signatories lead the very companies racing fastest to build superintelligence. Elon Musk has called AI a fundamental risk to the existence of civilization. Dario Amode has said there is a 25% chance that things go really, really badly, including extinction. This is an unprecedented situation where even the creators of the technology are saying that it's incredibly dangerous. Catastrophe, however, is not inevitable. These dangers can be averted. The race that so many see as unstoppable is taking place in a world where most people don't understand the threat. That can change. So, what can Canada do? Well, policymakers can say what other leaders seem to lack the courage to. That, according to top experts, the race to superintelligence is far too dangerous. Canada can start a global conversation that changes what's possible when it comes to averting this threat. This very House could ask the leaders of those companies to testify under oath about these grave dangers. The motion that initiated this study says that Canada should not unnecessarily slow down technological development. I, of course, agree. We can keep the self-driving cars, the chatbots of today, the AI-powered drug discovery tools, among many very promising AI applications. Much of the technology is extremely beneficial and promising. The only thing that we need to stop is the race to AIs that exceed humans in every way. The extremely specialized chips and enormous data centers essential to that race can be reined in. Canada cannot do this alone, but it can help start the global conversation. Canadian scientists led the way on this technology and continue to lead through their efforts to get the world to avert the danger. My hope is that Canada will use its voice and moral authority to push the world forward so that our best plan is not, we hope we get lucky, in the presence of this threat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bourgon. And with that, we're going to start our questioning. It's going to be a hell of a discussion, I think. Mr. Barrett, for 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Gilmain, the current reliance that we have is on a voluntary AI code, if I understand correctly, and the European Union enforces the AI Act, which is binding. From a compliance perspective, does this gap expose Canadians, Canadian businesses to legal uncertainty, and does it create a greater risk for privacy and algorithmic bias risks?
Thank you for your question. Not necessarily. And let me explain you why. We have at the moment data protection laws that are working pretty well, and we do have privacy commissioner at the federal level and in different provinces as well. And in these laws, we already have some existing requirements, including when it comes to AI, more specifically when there's an automated decision-making process. And it's interesting you raised the EU example, because I did mention it in my opening remarks that it came into force in 2024. But last Wednesday, as a matter of fact, when I got the invitation to this session, the same day, the European tabled the digital omnibus on AI. And essentially, this text aims to essentially extend timelines for compliance, but also to simplify the burden and the obligation on small and medium-sized organizations. So what it tells us, it does tell us that they came up with a proposal, but it's still evolving, while, we are moving forward. And I think it's important to keep this in mind.
What measures do you think should be in place to for individuals who are shaping AI policy to ensure and prevent that there isn't regulatory capture and conflicts of interest?
So in terms of the potential obligation we could think of is mostly potential compliance assessment, but not too much, because at the moment, what we are seeing, especially in Quebec, is a tendency to put impact assessment pretty much in any legislation we see. And that's a problem. And we see that it's not feasible for most organizations. There's potentially also the idea of more accountability documentation. So internally, having some procedures and processes. Again, the idea of policies and procedure is amazing. Even though I'm a lawyer, I'm a big fan of these documents. It's not sufficient. But finally, at the end, I think it's more about training within organization. And that's what we see more and more, at least with my clients. There's a goal to really, ensure, the staff knows, understand, the potential AI risk, but also potential, benefits for their own organization.
So it's a rapidly evolving space. We've seen companies like NVIDIA finance customer purchases of their own products to accelerate their adoption. Do you see similar risks if individuals with major AI investments are advising on Canada's AI policy, where their financial interests could shape the rules? That's what I'm driving at.
I'm not sure I follow you in terms of this question. My apologies.
Okay. I got part of an answer in the first half, so I'm going to move to my next one if that's okay. And if you reflect on it afterwards and you wanted to submit that back to the committee in writing, I'd appreciate that. Mr. Bourgon, your institute warns about catastrophic AI risks, though you did temper some of that in your opening statements, that it might not all be bad. But there is an absence of binding legislation, and we have a reliance on voluntary codes. Do you think that this approach is sufficient to prevent the worst case scenario, or do you think that to prevent the worst case scenario, the most extreme effort should be undertaken, which would be a moratorium until on development until robust conflict-free regulations are put in place?
Thank you. Great question. So, when I think about AI, I often try and separate the applications of AI and the current systems that we have today. And I think many of those should be regulated the way that most normal technologies and new technologies are regulated. The thing I focused most of my time on is thinking about where the technology is going and what the risk will be from these very advanced systems. I do think in that case, it is unfortunately a very challenging coordination problem. Any one actor deciding that they think that the risk is too great and slowing down does not really help avert anyone else building a system that would pose those risks. And so I think the kind of main area of focus should be on trying to have those conversations with partners to try and figure out what an agreement could be that they could come to stop pushing the frontier. But I do think that our best chance of not succumbing to that catastrophe is to find some way to agree with international partners on which frontiers we aren't going to push.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Monsieur Sarret pour 6 minutes.
Sorry for 6 minutes.
Make sure you have them on. Make sure you're on the proper translation. Monsieur Sarret pour 6 minutes. Commencez, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Sarret, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for your testimony. I find it very inspiring and very interesting. I would like to ask some questions about the history itself, because what would be dangerous would be to see a revolution or a request to change regulations around the world on something where we've seen resurgence of use and a resurgence in the use and operation of AI because it's popularized. But that being said, it's been more than 30 years. In fact, the first article that came out on AI was before 1954. It's very important to keep this in mind. Myself, today, I'm celebrating my birthday, and I was using for AI for more than 30 years, for predictive purposes. And I think it's a very important thing. And this is where I want to ask the question of both of you. And it's really not just a question of generative AI. We're not only talking about machine learning being supervised or not supervised, because in both cases, if you make regulations, how can you adapt it to both elements? I don't really see how it can be done, and that's why I would like to hear from you on your expertise in that regard. My question, I'll start by the following. For both of you, is it really viable to ask the government to regulate the technological development, or is it better, rather, to regulate the risk of use? Because if I'm a private company and I'm developing something, are you really going to regulate how I develop it, or rather the regulations of how it's used afterwards? And when I talk about use, it's data gathering, data processing, and communication of the data. And it's a much broader cycle. I'd like to hear you on that. Thank you for your question and happy birthday. I'm also very in good humor. I'd like to start by saying in this presentation, we focus a lot on risks. And rightly, there are risks, but there are also good things with AI. My second point would be to say, and I emphasize this because sometimes people get it, it's not an absence of things legally. I'm a cybersecurity and privacy lawyer, and there are rules, and I have work to do, and there's no problem there. But that being said, I think it's interesting to ask what type of AI we're talking about. And sure, we talked in the motion about super intelligence. There are levels of it. We can think about, as my colleague Mr. Bergen can talk about that, from a pedagogical viewpoint, we could talk about three types of AI. There's a restricted one, which is what we see now, even though it has increasingly sophisticated and broader possibilities or capacities. There's AI that would be more general, which would imitate human behavior. And then there would be a super AI that could come in, perhaps ultimately. And it's important to understand that this is not going to happen overnight. When we talk about super AI, we're talking about from the 50s, there was development, there was progress, there was growth, and now we're where we are today, but there's a growing trend that is not going to change overnight. I'm not saying, I think this study is essential, and Canada, as a general rule, really has quite a unique AI approach, particularly in adoption and also attempts at regulation, and I congratulate you for that, but you mustn't think that we're really in an immediate change that will happen that quickly. That's my viewpoint. Let's talk about attempts to regulate. It's been a long time now that I've been following the trends at regulation in the European Union. As you yourself said, even a week or 2 weeks ago, there have been changes. Let's take another example, not to rely only on the European Union, but Australia, for example. When an attempt was made to put regulatory requirements on companies, we saw that there was a lot of reticence, and some of them actually left the zone where that regulation applied. Do you think that this could be a risk? And what would you advise for the Canadian government in order to better regulate? And as I would say, regulation, fine, I go along with that fully. But how can we better regulate the use and while keeping our assets within our country? I think on the one hand, that the act will not solve all the problems. Regulation is a broader term than just legislation per se. There are different ways of regulating things through markets, through social needs, through the code. So it's really a very broad concept. I would like to talk to you about Quebec. Perhaps you've heard about Bill 25, the very intelligible act on privacy protection. Still today, I give group therapy and legal advice on this act. Why do I tell you that? Because it's an act that is highly demanding in terms of requirements, and small and medium businesses are placed in a very impossible situation. It's interesting because progress was made with new legislation. Does that mean that public protection is a higher goal? And does it mean that organizations are comfortable with that text? Yeah, I'm sure that if you did a survey, you would probably have quite surprising results. So the bill is a good instrument, this act, and that's my work. I work on this act, but you have to think about how it's enforced and how the regulator applies it. And this is really something to keep in mind, I think, in that regard. You have to keep in mind that Bill 25 doesn't only affect the way that you collect data, because we're talking about processing of data, utilization of data, and communication of data. But I appreciate your comment, and perhaps I'll have an opportunity to return to that again, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sari. Mr. Theriault, for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to make some introductory remarks. I proposed this study, which we're beginning on AI, and this committee, the standing committee, has 3 aspects: access to information, privacy protection, and ethics. And when I became aware of the declaration on the risks of AI, which is indeed signed by some of the artisans of AI, LinkedIn and Hinken and others, when I read that, I'll reread it. These people say that we need to reduce the risk of extinction caused by AI. It should be a worldwide priority alongside other risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. So this really surprised me considerably. And I said, is this really serious? And now we're looking and we take a look at this and we say, wow, it seems to me that there is an unbridled acceleration almost blindly towards building a superintelligence that is artificial and that would appear to focus mainly on economic interests and control of information rather than on human interests. There's a whole concept of human beings that underlies what is being done and the impacts of AI on human life. When we talk about the fact that they're going to be able to, when we talk about computer engineers, right now they can AI can do the job, then it'll mean that there'll be a revolution. And anyway, Mr. Gilman, I'll talk to you shortly, but I think things are moving faster than you claim. But Canada appointed a minister of artificial intelligence. That's not nothing. Mr. Bourgon, do you consider that these people in the statement you made correspond to the category of people who are alarmist?
Est-ce que vous avez déjà entendu?
No. Have you ever heard those claims that one cannot control artificial superintelligence and the development of artificial superintelligence?
Vous proposez quelque chose.
You propose something. I read your document, and you propose a scenario that ultimately is a scenario in which there's a stop button. Could you please explain what that is?
So in the context where I was saying earlier about how this is a coordination problem, I think, separating out the applications and the current things of AI from where things are going, which I can get into if people are interested, why those risks might present, and some of the history there. I think we need to build a world where we have the ability to make agreements to stop pushing the frontier of AI development and be able to verify and enforce those agreements. We're not there yet. We certainly don't have the political will to do anything like that. But we need to be able to build in the capability to have the option to do so. Sometimes we call this, branding is hard. Building an off switch. This doesn't mean something that would just shut down all AI development, but having the technical, institutional, and legal capability, should the political will be there, to be able to actually impose fairly strenuous restrictions on AI development, deployment, and diffusion for pushing the frontier of these very powerful general systems going towards superintelligence, to be able to build that capability. I think that's essential. And we've done the work that you read there. We've recently just released some work kind of trying to sketch out what a model international agreement would look like to be able to prevent the creation of this technology until we can do so safely, and start to enumerate the things that would need to be in place that make up the components of what we call this off switch to be able to actually enforce and verify that.
Moi, je me dis, on peut effectivement se
I am thinking that we may very well be concerned about the legislative side and the regulatory side, but it seems to me that it's necessary, given a statement such as this, that the committee should be able to get involved in an ethical thinking process. Citizens deserve having us think about this, because we're not talking about just anything. As dangerous as nuclear arms may be, however, it's quite codified and regulated. And what impresses me here is that is not the case in this area of research. It's as though people are fascinated by the applications of AI in various fields without even being able to conceive how far this could go. And all those applications will be used somewhere along the line for fundamental research, for the creation of a major artificial intelligence. Isn't that so?
One thing I often find myself saying is that it seems to be, it's kind of like slang, a general missing mood here when it comes to where the future of AI is going. Like even setting aside the risks of loss of control that I'm worried about, the current AI companies who are taking these risks very seriously, they're talking about building a technology, you can call it AGI, something else, but basically to have computers do the thinky thing that we do, that allow us to build rockets and go to the moon and develop novel science. You can think of this as automating automation. Setting aside those loss of control risks, this is still something that would make all cognitive labor economically redundant, that would automate automation. These companies expect to be able to build the systems that are approaching this in some small number of years. Maybe there's some advancement that's going to come in the way that they don't have. It could be 10. 5 years ago, we thought that AI systems that would be able to talk to us like they talk today were 20 years away, until someone came up with a new idea with the transformer, and then all of a sudden we made bigger AI systems, and they were talking to us. So there's a forecasting question here that's hard, but more money's going into these systems than ever have before, and we're making advancements.
Thank you, sir. Merci, Monsieur Thériault. Mr. Cooper, for 5 minutes, 5-minute rounds now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gilmain, you referenced the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act. It's been characterized by some as essentially the gold standard. I take it from your comments that you would not view it as such. Is that fair?
I don't know yet.
Okay. And you...
And if I may,
yes.
I did mention the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which is essentially, the golden standard. In the world, we started, seeing, many states changing their laws to essentially mimic this trend. It took a couple of years. It wasn't done in a year. And so at the moment, we know that the GDPR has been, we know the GDPR has been a success, in terms of its reach beyond the EU, but we don't know yet whether the EU AI Act will gain the same success. And the fact that the update I gave you, from a week ago, does demonstrate that we are still building the plane while we are, flying, if you will allow me the expression.
So just to clarify, you would view it as the gold standard?
You would what?
You would view it as the gold standard or not the gold standard? I mean,
I don't know.
You don't know.
I think it's interesting.
Okay.
If you were to ask me, I think this is really well thought. They really tried, to come up with something similarly to what we had in Canada in ADA. So clearly, this was this idea of proposing something. Is it sufficient? Is it needed? I don't know yet.
You spoke about some of the challenges, though, including the regulatory burden imposed on companies. I saw one assessment done by the EU that indicates that it could cost businesses hundreds of thousands of dollars for using just one AI system. That seems to be problematic. I hope you would agree with that. Would you care to elaborate on some of those issues around what I think is problematic in terms of the burdens that it places that aren't necessarily in line with some of the risks?
Absolutely. So I will give you an example. Let's say you were the owner of a CrossFit gym company. And let's say you're based out of Saint-Louis-du-Haha. And you want to use AI for real-time movement feedback and potentially performance tracking and predictive PRs, personal records. So you think it's a good idea for your members. Under the EU AI Act, this would require quite a bit of money to essentially, propose these features to your users. And so you would have to do compliance assessment. You would need to have in place accountability documentation, policies and procedures. You would need potentially to have some record keeping obligation, register in case of an incident. You would need to make sure that there's a human oversight. Potentially, you may have to notify someone if there's a problem. Remember, you're in Saint Louis du Haha, and you own a CrossFit gym. And I'm not saying I'm against this obligation. I think it makes sense in some situation. But the fact is, what we see with the new laws at the moment, with a lot of obligation, the massive problem is mostly for small and medium-sized enterprise. It seems that we have not found the response for these layers of organization that are really key for Canada. So I think that's my take. Again, I'm not against. I just think that it's a lot, and yeah.
Well, and here in Canada, we're really lagging behind when it comes to adaptation. And you cited the EU law. The UK has also done some work around AI regulation. It seems to me to be a more flexible approach with sector-specific guidelines. Do you have any thoughts on the UK approach? And is there anything to learn from what the UK is doing?
Thank you for citing the UK example. I think it's I'm not pretending to be an expert on this system, but it seems to me reasonable in a sense that we don't do nothing, but at the same time we focus on some sectors, which to me, makes a ton of sense. That's my initial reaction.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gilman and Mr. Cooper. Madame Lapointe pour 5 minutes.
MP Lapointe for 5 minutes. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're going to learn a lot, and you're going to help us carry things farther and do a better job of supervision. Mr. Gilman, earlier you spoke, well, we didn't necessarily have to go faster. You said we have to find where we can find gaps in present law. So what would that mean? Are you talking about Canada as a whole, or are you referring to Quebec? I'd like to hear you on that. Or do you think that we have just certain areas that are not adapted in the legislation? Thank you for your question. There are a lot of laws. I'm specialized in cybersecurity and privacy, but there are a lot of areas that are directly involved with AI, copyright, trademark, and consumer protection. And in those laws, there are always control authorities connected with implementing legislation with provisions that are all often technologically neutral. Often it's the ambition of a law to have a form of neutrality so that it can survive in the course of time. That is the case in privacy protection. We see that there are obligations that exist. It doesn't mention a specific technology, but it's broad enough potentially to broaden the usage cases, including any use of AI. I'm putting aside superintelligence because I think I even have a hard time defining it myself. But once that is said, it seems to me, and there's a tendency to adopt legislation because it's a good feeling. It seems to be pleasant, is a good thing. We've done something. But what I observe further downstream, there are regulators that have to implement or enforce those laws that have a certain capacity, whether it's in Canada and Quebec, they do an excellent job, but they are short of means to really be able to keep up to date on those changes. So according to my logic, maybe it's not so much a quantitative aspect of laws, because there are a number of laws, more and more, but the fact is that there are also very good regulators who themselves are capable of analyzing things and can even ring an alarm bell. I'll give an example. If we talk about the Quebec's Commission for Access to Information, they're responsible for enforcing Bill 25. Fine. And we observe that they have already spoken out on AI and have issued briefs and about what is the proper application of the bill to AI. And we find forms of regulation by means of existing laws. That being said, we won't solve that problem today, but they're also short of resources that the Commission. So I think that it could be done more generally. One could apply that generally. There are regulators that are high caliber. Perhaps the question really ought to be to give them a possibility to really look at the, really to keep their touch on something. In other words, to be able to have a good understanding and apply the legislation appropriately. So at least that's my personal feeling. So those people would help you upgrading things if there are any gaps in the legislation in order to make sure that we're not losing anything in terms of artificial intelligence. You're talking about protection of personnel, but it's also data in a broader sense. It's how this is done. Sure, I would say, in fact, that once again, aspects of data are closely connected to AI. In fact, artificial intelligence is never just the result of automatic learning or machine learning, as it's called. You have to have data in order to be able to arrive at a form of artificial intelligence. So as a result, what causes problems is personal information that can identify you or other people or groups directly. So that is often the risk. It's not the only risk, but the data that are used to arrive at a result are subject to legislation now. So that's really my position. I don't claim to be an AI advocate. I know my field. I'm a lawyer in privacy, and it's a technology that I include in my practice. I think it's really my message today. Thank you very much.
Que ça prendrait une conversation global conversation.
You said, Mr. Bourgault, that it would take a global conversation. Do you think that you have any preferences worldwide, and where should we begin from?
I think I would certainly defer to the experts in various international diplomacy circles about which forums are the best. The United Nations exists, so does the OECD. I'm not sure which ones would be the best case for this global conversation. I'm very happy to, speak more to what I think would need to be part of that conversation. But I think the main important thing here is for people who are in those roles, who have the opportunity to do that, to understand this problem such that they can start having those conversations.
Okay. Merci, Madame Lapointe. Mr. Bourgnon. Monsieur Thériault pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Thériault, 5 minutes. What really struck me in your thought process is how one could actually lose control. There was a very good article published in La Presse last year, and it was Mr. McKenna who had met Mr. Bengio, who will be coming here, and he said towards a competence that is similar to humans, artificial intelligence can rebel against the orders that is given to it. And then he says, for the last 6 months, Mr. Bengio says, the AI has been acting more and more autonomously and also more and more in order to preserve themselves. And in order to escape, they will hack the system, recopy their own codes rather than the new code that would actually replace them. Later on, he gives another example, Claude Opus 4. And which is the most recent large language model. And he said it read private emails, and it found out that its engineer was cheating on his wife, and it also discovered that it was eventually going to be replaced by another Claude. And in order to avoid being replaced, the AI decided to actually blackmail its own engineer, which is completely amazing. Nobody'd asked him to do this, obviously. And so it's an important point, and this is where I'm trying to get at. So what the researcher in Montreal was fearing was the uncontrolled agentivityness, if you like, or the way that the most popular models right now are being developed. We ask them to do all sorts of things without any human supervision, and they can deactivate themselves, and that might be interpreted as a way of not completing the task. So can you make a comment on this?
This is all kind of things that we were kind of expecting to see, and now we're seeing the evidence of it. There's a very technical concept here. It goes by the term of convergent instrumental drives or incentives. It's the idea that if you actually have a sufficiently intelligent mind, artificial or otherwise, that's trying to accomplish a task, There are certain things that aren't necessarily goals that you would train into the system. There's a separate topic to have about how we don't even have a reliable way to train the goals we want into AI systems. But putting that aside, there are many goals that would come along with that that are just instrumentally useful for AI systems accomplishing whatever goal they might be pursuing. One of those is self-preservation, not for some human desire to continue living, but it's very difficult to accomplish a goal if you're not around or active to accomplish the goal that you're trying to accomplish. Another would be resource acquisition. It's often easier to pursue the goal that you're trying to pursue if you have more resources to do so. Another example is resistance to having your objectives changed. So if you're trying to accomplish a goal, you're not going to be very good at accomplishing it if you allow someone to change the goal that you're trying to accomplish. All this was kind of theoretical 10 years ago, certainly made a lot of common sense. Now we're starting to see that when we have AI systems that are general and capable enough to be situationally aware in this way, that these behaviors are starting to manifest. Now, they kind of look silly. They kind of make silly mistakes. You see their chains of thought where they're plotting and saying these things, and we're like, well, that's kind of dumb. Like, how is that going to cause a problem? They're thinking out loud about the ways in which they're trying to deceive us or do these dangerous things. These are all test environments. The concern is that, the AI systems will not stop at what we have today. The goal of the whole field in some sense, and certainly of these companies, is to build these very powerful general systems that are much smarter than us. And not only will they be much more dangerous with these convergent instrumental goals and whatever goals they are pursuing, which we don't know how to train into them reliably, but as they become more intelligent, like I mentioned in my statement, they become increasingly situationally aware. So when we test them for some of these behaviors, we start to see them saying things like, oh, this seems like a test to me. And then when they behave the ways that we expect them to or want them to in tests, it becomes harder to know whether we've reliably actually created a safe system because it is situationally aware of how we're expecting it to behave. And as these systems become more powerful, have more autonomy, have more control over how the world and the economy works, that could lead to extremely bad outcomes.
13, 10, 9, 8.
13, 8, 9. Okay, no, we'll. I think
2 minutes though, plus. Monsieur Hardy.
I think another 2 minutes, Mr. Hardy, 5 minutes, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, gentlemen, for being here today. Just to get us back into the context, in AI, we have right now, we've got you're kind of a doom and gloom guy. Mr. Bourgon sees a threat and a danger to humanity. Then there's the enthusiasts and the realists. And I think Mr. Guillemin is more in the realistic camp. I think it's important to situate ourselves and look at the timeline. Where are we? We're at actually a crossroads of new technology. It's not new. We've gone through this before. Remember scientists who told us at 100 kilometers an hour, a human was going to explode if he was in a car. And then we saw the internet. We saw the year 2000, many changes. Many people thought it was the end of work as we knew it. And I would like to hear what you have to say on what is so different. I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say, but what is the difference considering all of the knowledge that we have now? And, 10 years ago, we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know what the internet was going to become in the 1990s. What is so different about now? Why is it that we need to regulate and legislate as fast as possible all of this technology, which has actually been working up for the last 100 years? So, Mr. Guillemin, I think that's a really good question. There is a geopolitical factor right now, which is pushing us to ask ourselves a great number of questions because there is an acceleration in the use of AI. So we need to ask a whole bunch of questions. Now, the issue is, do we need to legislate that quickly? That is the question. So if I look at the situation very coldly, regulation, superintelligence, my position is that I cannot define what superintelligence actually is. I'm not saying it doesn't worry me. Quite the contrary. I see the future. I have a family. I'm extremely realistic about what it might mean. But the question is the means of actions the way that we have to do is through a law, a kind of moratorium on a technology that we can't even define, or is it rather to be interested in what we actually have right now? Gen AI, general use, some that are a bit more risky in terms of biometrics, justice, etc. I'm rather down to earth about our priorities at the present. Mr. Bourgon?
Large, and unfortunately, we're allowed to have many problems at once. We're allowed to have the problem of their pressing regulatory issues with artificial intelligence, and also have to worry about the trajectory of the technology and where it's going. To your question of people in the past who have been worried about various past general purpose technologies, I would agree that many of them, the people who warned about the risks, were wrong about their impacts. Some of them, sometimes they were right. Turns out that nuclear weapons were real, and they're very catastrophic, and we treat them very differently than the internet. But yes, for many technologies, there are people who are always going to, kind of make a big stir about them. I do think that general purpose, very powerful artificial intelligence systems are different in a real sense. Having a system that's not just automating a particular cognitive task, not just automating a particular physical task, but is actually doing the type of thinking that we would be doing, or something similar to it, such that it could automate the process of automation itself, is kind of different in kind and should be treated different in kind. I certainly heard in your question that there is some speculation about when it will come and what its effects will be. Technological progress and forecasting in that domain is notoriously hard. I agree. That said, it certainly seems that when we look at the history of the field and how much trouble we've had developing this technology, even back then when the people founded the field, Alan Turing, I.J. Good, were already imagining what it would look like if they succeeded. And they were already thinking about these risks and what it would take to control a system much smarter than us. And now I think something has changed in the trajectory of that technology, which I can speak to, that means that we should be thinking that it's coming much sooner than we otherwise did.
Alors, si on prend ça présentement très froidement,
So, if we look at things coldly, so AI is going to use the data that it's given. So that sentence, junk in, junk out. So if you give it wrong information, false information, it's going to have hallucinations, it's going to get false information, and sometimes you've got to compete with different AIs in order to try and get the right information. So right now we're at a junction, I think, that there's as much good as bad that can come out of it. I think we can agree on that much. But should we not have a system that adapts itself as quickly in the terms of the law and follows the technology? I'll explain myself. So lots of good things are going to come out of AI, like medicine, energy, science. We know that AI can think 24 hours a day and truly advance certain technologies on things that we can't do. So there is actually a positive side. Sorry, I finished. Yes, I was. It was a wonderful statement. Yes, I did have a question in there.
Je m'excuse. Ms. Church for
I'm sorry about that.
question.
I want to give other people more time for other questions. And if you want to come back, we might have a little extra time for you.
Good afternoon. So some of my interests are really around the area of consumer protection and competition. And when I think about how AI is emerging, I think a little bit about how some of the constraints in traditional areas of innovation don't exist here. You have, for one thing, you have the immense resources that it takes to actually create, develop, and operate AI, and so that limits the field of who can actually participate in this to begin with. I think that's an issue. You also have a very underdeveloped, if any, framework for consumer protection or product liability. So I guess my first question to you, maybe Antoine and then Mr. Bourgon, would be just how do we should we build in a concept of product liability into a framework that we're looking at, and how would you suggest that we do that?
Probably. And I think there are two different ways of thinking of product liability. Either you think of a standalone AI Act, and I tend to think that's not the response. However, looking at different Consumer Protection Act and looking at potentially the Civil Code in Quebec could be an option to assess what are the gaps. But I will tell you, when we look at, for instance, the civil code because, I'm of a civilist tradition in terms of my training. I like to think that jurists are pretty creative. And we've seen already, some interpretation of the law, essentially, being adjusted, with some use of AI. And so in that sense, I'm probably quite confident that our current laws can evolve in terms of AI implication. I know what I know what I don't know. I'm not pretending to be an expert when it comes to consumer protection. That is not my field of specialty. However, it would be interesting potentially to have a regulatory body in the field, potentially, raising the finger and saying, well, we realize that there's a gap, so we want to tweak an existing act to essentially make sure that this is being captured. And that's essentially my position when it comes to AI. Much more efficient. It does require, everyone at the table to be involved, but that's very different from essentially, enacting, a potential, act on product liability, something that we've seen in Europe as an example, because it does exist. There are some directive and regulation on product liability, but the regime is fundamentally different in terms of the way, it's presented. So that's my initial reaction to your question.
I'll be a little outside of my lane here. I do think that liability can be a useful tool here. I don't think it resolves, the big picture concerns that I'm worried about, but certainly on the trajectory to those types of systems, I expect that we'll get increasingly capable general purpose AI systems, which will be difficult to treat with liability in a sector specific way, because the same system that can be an expert biologist that could help with drug discovery can also be the same system that can be used for autonomous hacking and also for helping developers find vulnerabilities in their code. That same model that can help with novel drug discovery can also potentially help someone develop dangerous biological compounds. And so there's a sense in which the people making this technology are making something so general and increasingly powerful in its ability to manipulate reality that it makes sense to me to think about how they should potentially have some liability for ensuring that this technology that they're putting out there doesn't have certain harms. Again, that's not going to ultimately solve the incentives for racing for superintelligence, but it certainly seems to make sense on the way there.
But it does, I guess, to your point, you raised some very serious possible types of harm that come from the operation of this technology. And so how should we as legislators look at that and try to, what type of safeguards or guardrails could we put in place to prevent that harm and not just try to deal with it after the fact, after it happens?
I would say, and I do think that some of the foundations of this are also useful for the stuff that I'm worried about with loss of control, but that there's a certain school of thought which is we should just let these people cook. The technology will cause a bunch of enormous benefits and we don't want to limit it. I find it hard to imagine that we're going to end up in a stable world if we succeed at creating these systems that are increasingly capable, that have these dual use capabilities that will have national security implications. We want AI developers to be able to make models that can help with novel drug discovery. Do we want those models that might also be able to help someone create an unprecedentedly powerful bioweapon? Do we want those models to be open source? We should probably have some framework under which we know who is capable of training a genius in a data center and what we can do with those very powerful technologies. I think if we just proliferate them openly in perpetuity, that this just creates a world that's unstable that we won't be able to control. That's not to say there aren't a bunch of benefits to open sourcing some of these models, and we should open source all the ones that we can, where we don't impose those risks.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Church. Je pense que j'attends qu'on va compléter.
I'm expecting that we will finish our second hour. And now, if the witnesses are willing to stay for 3 rounds of 2-minute questions each, is that all right? Yes, Mr. Theriault, and then Mr. Hardy, and then Mr. Seni, okay? The reason why I think that we really need to hold a conversation about ethics is that ethics is much more demanding than the law. And to think that regulation and the law is the smallest common denominator in a society that shares values. So first we have to understand what it is we're talking about in order to find the real means. So this statement here must not be set aside. 800 people have worked on this, and to say they're all alarmists, no, there are good things and bad things about AI. The new minister of AI has said that he would put less stress on regulation, but how it can be used economically as a technology. Do you think that this approach is somewhat naive? Mr. Bourgon, what do you feel about this statement?
Which applications and which kind of AI he's talking about. Many people are surprised to hear that there is a recent executive order in the United States about the Genesis mission to have the U.S. government integrate AI and accelerate a bunch of science with AI and remove barriers to doing that. I think that's great. I'm supportive of that. If we're talking about, kind of disregarding and trusting the companies to kind of do whatever they want as they scale to these powerful systems, I would disagree with that part. So unfortunately, I don't know exactly what the minister was talking about. There's one way that I could very much agree with what he said, and there's another way that I think it would be extremely a big mistake.
Oui, on le fera venir.
Yes, we will have him. We've invited him, and we will be asking him the question directly.
Merci. Je suis bon, hein?
Right.
Thank you.
40 seconds.
Yes, they're good. Yeah, well, excellent. Lesson in 45 seconds. Yes, Mr. Hardy. So we were saying that there are many positive applications in AI, and it needs some controls as well. So like Mr. Bourgon has just answered to Mr. Jay, we're going to ask this to Mr. Guillemin. Do you think that it's a good idea to have evergreen laws, because this is an area that is going to evolve very, very quickly. So we want to propel the good. So we leave things go to some extent. We see how it's being used. Is it being used logically, ethically? And if we're like, oh, oops, this is going kind of the wrong way, let's legislate, but still keep things going forward if it's good for humanity, medically, humanity. I'll ask you to answer that. It's such an honor to be here with you at this committee. If really we were to have evergreen laws, I would be able to go to all the birthdays of every single member here, because there's the pace of change is at such a rate between legislative changes and societal changes. And I must say that evergreen laws, science is well, law is reaction. Law is not ethics, and unfortunately, law by its very essence is imperfect. It'll never be perfect. And what happens is a little bit like Don Quixote. He's always in advance of his time. He's trying to evolve. He's trying to catch up. Can we be a visionary? Can we be neutral technologically speaking? And my fear is that it's hard enough right now just to define what is actually AI. And fundamentally, recently, we didn't even know in Canada what a high incidence of AI system really was. We could just debate all day on this very notion. So what makes me afraid in that particular approach is that I can go and celebrate with you each one of your birthdays every single year, but that's really what's at stake, because this meeting is actually fundamental. We'll have other meetings, but the reality is, can we say that laws can be evergreen and continue evolving perpetually? And I think it's difficult, especially think about the fax machine. Who uses a fax machine anymore? And it used to be in the civil code. So it's a little bit funny. We've got technologies, old technologies, and maybe in 5 years, the very idea of super intelligence will not exist, but we will call it something else. And so we'll still be stuck with certain notions. Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Mr. Sidney?
Thank you for coming. And this is something very amazing and also very alarming. My question to both of you, should the Parliament use AI? And if such, should it be limited to Parliament work such as voting, consideration of law, enacting laws? I'd like to hear both of your.
It would have taken me a lot longer to make my speech as eloquent as it was if I didn't have an AI model helping me. And I talk to people who are in policy all the time who currently don't have access to these models and are secretly doing the research that the models are helping them with to do whatever policy brief on their phones because they don't have access to them. So I think there's, the models still hallucinate. There are problems. People have to understand how to use the current models in ways that will help their work. But I think it's going to increasingly be the case that for the AI systems of today, you're just going to fall behind if you're not finding ways to integrate them into your work life. And that's no different for Parliament.
Same response. I think it should be used with responsibly. And I like always to say that AI, what we have at the moment is a bad summer student, a really bad one that can be tested, but still, it's useful for some tasks. So that's what we have today. And to me, it would be, I think it's also good to use it, on a daily basis, including the people that are very skeptical, because at the end of the day, it's not going to go away.
Is there other governments that Canada could follow as a lead to see those systems are working and are protecting the dignity of?
I mean, I think from my perspective, the country who's invested the most in this would be the UK with their AI Safety Institute. I think that organization is kind of the most well-resourced government body that is trying to understand AI very holistically, look at the threats, try and understand the big alignment problems that I'm talking about, and try and be the place that the government has permission, feels like it has permission to actually listen to on these issues and does some of the best work. In fact, when I'm talking to U.S. policymakers, I often give them trouble, and I'm like, why are you guys letting them hire all the best Americans to go advise them about this technology? There's a bunch of smart Canadians that the government could probably be hiring to do the same thing. I think the UK is doing great work here.
Mr. Anton, you have any?
It depends on the topics. If it comes to innovation, you may have seen the recent Genesis Mission executive order in the US. Clearly, they're interested in innovation. When it comes to regulation, UK is probably a good example. I would say at the moment that any jurisdiction, any country has something to bring to the table. And Canada, that's, the core of Canada. We take what's best, from the rest of the world. And that's, I believe, from my perspective, the DNA of this country. And I think we can, by watching, being, slow and steady, really, organized, I think we could potentially get to an amazing place.
Thank you, Mr. Sene. Thank you both, Mr. Guillemet and Mr. Bourgneau, for being here for our first meeting. As committee members know, the work plan showed that we were going to have the Minister of Artificial Intelligence here. And just for the benefit of the committee, we've reached out probably 8 or 9 times, Madam Clerk, to the Minister to appear. And that still has not been arranged. So if anybody has any ability to make sure that the minister comes here to be before the committee, I would suggest strongly that that you push him and his office to do that, okay? Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and providing what I thought was fascinating information to the committee. Thank you both. I'm going to suspend. We're going to go in camera to deal with committee business. The meeting is suspended. We'll return in a few minutes.
Bless you.
Okay. So.
Thank you.